So let's start off by looking at this old painting that I made in college. I think this is a great example of what we're trying to avoid. Because when you look at this painting, you'd think that it sort of gives you a sense of realism. After all, there's shiny reflections and small details, and it's got this full value range. Which sounds good, right? Well, there's something about it that's just off. And what's off, it turns out, is that there's a lack of identifiable materials. And the result is just sort of a homogeneous approach to values. Now, if I did a paint over, it could be improved quite a lot, and all I'd need to do would be modify some of these values. I didn't need to add any fancy details or special effects. I really just modified the values that were already there. So when we compare this with a painting like this one from Caravaggio, there's a world of a difference. Here you can see that all of the objects are being illuminated by the same light source, and yet they don't have an equal treatment. Some parts have sort of overall value shifts, which means they take up different parts of the value scale. The character's skin, for instance, represents a very different part of the value scale than the table and the game board do. And the end result you get from all this is readability. As a viewer, I can look at this image and the first read I get is something sort of simple. You could say it reduces well. And all that is to say the first impression doesn't confuse me. Then if I were to sit around for a while and sort of look at this image, I'd get all the smaller details and all the surface information. But it's that initial impression that's so important. And if you're not handling your values intentionally, you can really mess up this initial impression. So in this series, we're going to look at the fact that it's not just good brush technique that makes Caravaggio's painting a good one. He has a sort of structured composition with big blocks of value that make it easier for you to approach as a viewer. And there's a really neat tool that we're going to be using that you might be overlooking. And the tool is called the histogram. And you can see right now I have it set to luminosity, and that's what you want. That means we're talking about the grayscale value range of this image. And what it does is measure. And the result is sort of a relative peaks and valleys that'll tell me how much of each value is in my image. And the really cool thing is I can have it just pick what's in my selection. So if I were to make a selection here of the background, you can see it gives me a nice peak at a bright value. Or if I were to select his sleeve, it would give me a dark one. Now I've gone ahead and isolated some parts of this image here. And so if I were to just select the tabletop, you can see the values look one way. And then if I were to just select the skin, the values look a very different way. So what you're seeing here is a value graph on the x-axis and an intensity or a concentration graph on the y-axis. So what it means is you're getting a quick but very objective, very specific measurement of whatever you want, whether it's the reference that you're looking at or your painting itself. And the beauty is it's all visual. There's no numbers. And like I showed with a Caravaggio painting, different areas, selections will give you very different looking results. And the more you do this, you're going to start to recognize patterns. If you see something that's flat, it means there is very little or none of that value. If you see a spike, that means there's relatively a lot of that value. A narrow band means something has low contrast. A wider band means it has higher contrast. And remember, that's because it takes up more of the value scale. If you were to see a wider band that within that band had peaks, that means you have high overall contrast, but there's a specific part of the value range that it has a real lot of, and that's where that peak is. And of course, when we look at an entire image, a flat reading means we're missing that part of the value scale completely. And I think as a good rule of thumb, an image ought to contain almost the entire value range, so it comes very, very close to touching each of these ends, but it doesn't quite get there. And this is going to give you a nice high contrast result. If you have a very narrow band in your overall image, it means you have a relatively low contrast image. And generally this is not what you want, although if you're doing it on purpose, this is the result you'd want to look for. Knowing how to use the histogram is going to help us critically examine our examples and our studies. Because if you're studying a piece of reference, just dragging a quick selection and taking a value measurement can really help clarify what it is you're seeing. I think the most important takeaway of this entire series is learning to avoid what I call contrast creep. And what I mean by this is it's our natural inclination to enhance the contrast of objects that we're looking at. You sort of get tunnel vision. If I were to be looking at a single rock on a beach and using it as reference, if I were painting this study, I'd look really carefully at the rock and I'd notice all this cool patterning and all these little details. There's kind of a lot going on. So I would start painting it in black and white, and my tendency might be to exaggerate the value scale accidentally. I would give it dark darks and light lights, and having that wide value range first just looks good as a single image, and also it allows me to show all those cool little details that I'm seeing. But if I give it this much of the value range to, this single rock, what were to happen if I were to back up and look at the rest of this beach? In my painting, I might then have to treat all the rocks on the beach in the same way. And as you can see, this gives me a very visually confusing result. On one hand, it looks what you call noisy visually, as in it's confusing and hard to look at. And it also doesn't really look all that realistic. So what worked in a single object scenario, my little rock study, no longer applies when seen in the context of this entire scene. In context, it's really clear that these rocks have too much contrast relative to the other values in the rest of the scene. And so that's what I call contrast creep. By having that laser focus on the single object, the one that I was looking at, my eyes compensate and start to see lots of details and lots of contrast, and I forget the context. And when that happens, it's very easy to exaggerate the lights and darks and attempt to make the one little part of the image you're working on look really cool. But that often comes at the expense of the rest of the image. Another term for this concept is local contrast. Local, as in within a single object, is different than global, as in all of the objects in my scene. Because it's good to have your entire scene have high global contrast. That's what gives it a sense of drama and really makes use of the medium. But you rarely want each object to have such relatively high local contrast. Looking back at our still life here, we can see that each object represents a very different range of the value scale. And as a result, it has a very clear read. It reduces well. And then back to my original painting here from college, we can see that the same is not true. Here I've got a lot of global contrast. There is a very big value range represented in the image as a whole. But I also have a lot of local contrast. If you were to isolate almost any of these individual objects, the histogram is going to look essentially the same. This is not good. These movie screenshots here are much more what we're going for. They give good, quick reads. They're clear. A quick way to test this is just by squinting. No, seriously, squint your eyes at the monitor right now and look at these images. My guess is you can still see all the important stuff. When you do this, you are not able to see tiny little surface details, and all you can see are those sort of big, large-scale value differences. And if the image has a good, quick read, you're still going to be able to tell what's going on. Now, in Photoshop, you can test this by shrinking the image, or here I've gone ahead and used a filter called Surface Blur, which sort of retains those large-scale values, but it's going to blast out all the small-scale details. And in doing so, it gives us a great insight into what's working about these successful examples. This shot from Top Gun is a great example. You can see two planes, a middle ground, and a background, and the sky. Everything has a very distinct value range. So you could get rid of all the tiny little details in this and it wouldn't matter. The image would read exactly the same. Now in this one, it's a totally different approach. We still have very distinctive value areas, but they're not coming from the sort of material properties. Instead, we have a really, really strong directional light, and so the image is being broken up into this graphic light and shadow. And in that way, you're getting a sense of the form, and it's all coming from that directional light. The approach here in the Darjeeling Limited is exactly the opposite. Here, the light is very, very diffused, and yet we still have a nice graphic read from a value standpoint. Well, why is that? In this case, it's just costuming. They decided we are going to keep these characters looking distinguishable from one another, and we're going to do it with just the clothes they're wearing. So you can see they have different colored suits, different colored shirts under the suits, and one of them is wearing a big headband. And all of these things are going to add to that initial easy read. And this actually brings up another really important point, which is that value is not always about strict realism. In the case of choosing costumes, that was an intentional choice which made the overall composition work better. Well, when you're working with an illustration, we'll use this photo of the beach again as an example, you can choose to change things for the greater good. You saw the difference between the photo and then the photo with the higher contrast rocks. Well, that was a change that did not help. That was the opposite of what we wanted. Well, here I've done some adjustment layers to tweak this as if I might with a painting. And what you see is a much clearer image. It just reduces better. So in a sense, I've thought of this in terms of the big important shapes, and then I've given each of them more of a single value. So it has a sort of graphic puzzle quality. And then when you add those details back in, it still has sort of a quick initial read. So your homework is going to be trying to create nice looking initial reads like these examples, but we're not going to do any brushstrokes at all. Because essentially this starting point is treating all the objects as if they had the same surface properties, and clearly they shouldn't. So what I've created for you and put in the resources folder is a worksheet set up as a sort of value range experiment. And again, our goal is going to be to make a variety of thumbnails that look like these, each of which has sort of a nice separation of values, a good quick read. But the only thing you can change are these adjustment layers that I've given you. And you won't need to do any brush strokes at all. So to see how this works, let's take a look at the urn. So on the urn adjustment layer, I'll just click on this little black and white circle. And then when I move these arrows around, I can change the levels that are represented in this image. But because of the mask, it's really only applied to this one area of the painting. So remember, you can use these ones down here on the bottom, which are called output levels. And if I were to move the black arrow to the right side of the screen, it would lighten the image overall, because you're essentially saying the darkest part of this shape is now a midtone. Or I could go the opposite way. I could take the white handle and bring it towards the middle, and that's going to darken the whole image. Likewise, if I were to bring these handles up here towards one another, it gets higher contrast. And those can be combined with the output levels as well. So with these 5 different arrows, you are able to overwrite the values in that initial gray render and sort of experiment with what these shapes might look like with different value ranges. And then I can click on a different one to, maybe I'll try out the cloth now. So I click on the little black and white circle next to the cloth, and I'll do the same thing. So here I can change the way the values are represented in this image. Now because these are adjustment layers, I can actually hide them, and I've not made any permanent changes. So if I were to hide all of these, they would just go back to the original version. And what that gives you is a little test bed to try out a variety of sort of radically different value arrangements just to see how things could look. Now, this is not how I paint. Don't get the wrong impression here. The idea of this is to prove to yourself that understanding value range is half the battle. Even without picking up the brush tool a single time, I can change this image to look wildly different. If I wanted to have a focal point, I would probably make one of these objects higher contrast than the others, and then surround it with objects that made it pop off the page. And of course, doing this in your own paintings, you'd be using the paintbrush for this. For a variety of technical reasons, it's not a great idea to do this for a finished painting with the adjustment layers. But for experimenting, I think this really proves a very important point. So I encourage you to try some radically different ideas and see what you can come up with. So in parts 1 and 2, we talked a lot about a single object being lit. And it's possible that you've spent a lot of time just practicing painting one object with no background. Well, for the rest of this series, we are going to expand that a bit. We're going to talk about simple ways to approach a full composition. Because remember, you don't want to just think about the rock on the beach. If you just paint one rock at a time, you're going to end up with a noisy mess. Instead, we're going to think of it all in context. We want that quick, easy initial read. So let's see how we can approach that even from our imagination.